Hello, everybody. Welcome to our final lecture. We finally have made it. We got one more day. This is the one more day. Um, so let's just get into it. This is for Friday, May 8th. We are starting with new president, George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker. He's known as Bush 41 because his son was number 43. That's the number of president they were. Um, he was Reagan's vice president. He was, before that, the director of the CIA. So he's got quite a bit of diplomatic experience. And he's quite knowledgeable. And he basically he uses the positive momentum from the Reagan years to coast to victory in 88. I don't want to say he rode Reagan's coattails, but Reagan was very popular in a lot of places in the U.S. after his two terms. And so when his former running mate and vice president decided to run for president, people just thought, well, keep the good times rolling, and they rode with George H.W. Bush. Now, Bush wasn't a bad president, but he had his struggles, and he's been villainized for quite a few things that happened during his time. But during his time is officially when the Berlin Wall falls. So he takes over in 89, the Berlin Wall comes down, and Germany is reunified in 1990. No more East and West Germany, now it's reunified Germany. Poland sees the fruits of their solidarity movement, their unionization and decentralization of the government. So people's rights, basically. And Poland is allowed to gain its further freedom from the Soviet Union. And then when that happens, the rest of Eastern Europe starts to distance itself from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union just falls apart. Now, I mentioned this in world history last year, but Mikhail Gorbachev wins a Nobel Prize because he lets it fall apart peacefully. He doesn't try and latch on and unleash the military and try and hold on to what he has left. He lets it fall apart peacefully. He lets the people choose how they want to be ruled. If they want to be a democratic nation, he lets those people choose that. And a lot of Russian people don't like him because of it. Because Russians, like some Americans, place their own pride ahead of just about anything else. And the world's view of them is very important. And so when the Soviet Union falls apart, some Russian people think the world sees them as weak, and they blame Gorbachev. Gorbachev's still alive today, and he's still a controversial person in Russia. Now, as time has gone on, people's opinions of him have improved, but he was seen almost like a hero everywhere but his home Russia. But today, he's still looked at kind of skeptically by his own people. Then we have START, which was the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. This was probably the strictest and most limiting arms treaty. They had to get rid of both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had to get rid of 6,000 nuclear missiles, which was a ton. And then START 2 negotiations began in 93, but it doesn't actually follow through. It was just further reductions or plan for further reductions, but they don't end up coming to fruition. Now, there's an incident in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, which Tiananmen Square is in Beijing. It's one of the largest town squares in the world. It's actually the site where Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China, which is, the communist rule of China. Well, there had been a lot of protests and a lot of people clamoring for more domestic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of democracy, and all that. And there were protests, and finally the government decides to declare martial law, which when you declare martial law, it does things like, it's just a heightened state of awareness. It enlists a curfew for everybody. It has military personnel basically walking the streets with guns, making sure you don't do anything wrong. It places like double penalties on any kind of crime. It's a very nerve-wracking, intense situation. And when he sends the government sends the military in to break the protests, things turn violent. And civilians and peaceful protesters are shot and killed by assault rifles and even tanks. And the numbers on deaths aren't well known because China didn't release any of those figures, but people estimate anywhere from hundreds to possibly even thousands of civilians died as a result of it. And the rest of the world condemns China and places embargoes on them and penalties and stuff, but it doesn't actually get them to shift out of their oppressive ways. In fact, it just ups their oppression. They re-upped their media limitations, which still exist today. So after Germany reunifies the Soviet republics, the countries that were around before the Soviet Union swallowed them up, basically. They begin to seek their independence also. Like Yugoslavia breaks up because it was just the conglomeration of a bunch of different countries. And the countries that came out of Yugoslavia were Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, a bunch of those really small Balkan countries regain their independence, and Yugoslavia is no more. Same with Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is divided into Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia, and then the rest of Eastern Europe gets to reestablish its own non-communist government. So 91, the Cold War officially ends because the Soviet Union is no more, and if you're going to have any kind of war, whether violent or diplomatic, you have to have an enemy, and there wasn't one anymore. I mean, Russia technically was pretty similar to the Soviet Union, but they were no longer communist either. Like they turned into a somewhat of a democratic republic. So that was the end of that, but that doesn't mean it's the end of conflict. So I'll move that down. Bush 41 still runs into some conflict, starting with in Latin America. Operation Just Cause. We wanted to expel a former ally. Manuel Noriega was the leader of Panama, but he started to go rogue on us, and he was heavily involved in drug trafficking. He was actually an informant for the CIA back in the day, so he and H.W. Bush had really close connection, being that Bush was the head of the CIA at the time. but Noriega starts to distance himself, and him and the U.S. become at odds. So then he starts leading these civil rights abuses or abuses of humanity on his own people. So we launch an invasion and arrest Noriega, take him back to the U.S. He serves. He gets sentenced to like 30 years in jail, where he dies in jail. And we put in a different government. Now that government wasn't necessarily friendly with us. We did some damage when we invaded Panama. Maybe 1,000 or 2,000 civilians were killed, and they had to start from scratch because Noriega was so corrupt that he basically ruined their economy. So Panama didn't like us for a while. Now, we weren't enemies, but they were pretty cold. And I'll go to the bottom one first there. Operation Restore Hope, Somalia, which is in Africa. Somalia was going through some really rough times as the country was up in arms. There were multiple warlords that were fighting for power, and the people were really struggling. Like, it was one of the most dire places in the world, and the civilians were just absolutely starving and disease-ridden. So we tried sending humanitarian help, like clean food, medicine, clean water, through the United Nations. And some of the warlords took that as an act of aggression, and some peacekeepers, some United Nations peacekeepers, were killed. And so the U.S. decided to send Marines in to protect the peacekeepers. This doesn't turn into a conflict, actually. It's really just a operation to protect the people that were sending humanitarian aid to Somalia. And it continues for a few years because it is successful. We're able to get supplies into the citizens that desperately needed it. And since then, that's kind of been a model for how we approach humanitarian aid to other countries in Africa. Like recently, a dire situation has been founded in Sudan and South Sudan, and we've also been escorting peacekeepers and humanitarian aid in with military because it worked so well in the early 90s. Then we come to Operation Desert Storm. So how this happens is Iraq emerges from the Iran-Iraq War as probably the more powerful Arab country than Iran. They were less damaged after that, and they were kind of power hungry, specifically Saddam Hussein, who we helped. So Iraq invades a little country there just on the southeast border of Iraq. They invade Kuwait. Kuwait is known for its oil, and the U.S. had a good relationship with Kuwait, and so we got to use their oil quite a bit. They invade Kuwait, and then in doing so, they show aggression towards their southern neighbor, Saudi Arabia. Guess what Saudi Arabia has a lot of? Oil. And Saudi Arabia was probably our greatest ally of the Arab countries. So when they invade Kuwait and then threaten invasion on Saudi Arabia, we see this as a reason to step in and help. Now, we decided we don't want to get caught doing this alone again. So the U.S. creates a 35-country coalition against Iraq. So it's Iraq against 35 countries. Now, it was nothing more than just selling some weapons or giving some soldiers. The U.S. was about 60% of the soldier strength. But after, I think the whole thing takes about 5, 6 months. And Operation Desert Storm is the attack on Iraqi forces in Kuwait, and they are pushed back. The Iraqi soldiers are pushed back into Iraq, and Kuwait is liberated. So Kuwait retains its independence. And then the U.S. decides to push back into Iraq a little bit, but they decide not to pursue because they think it could get messy. And then, then Iraq's up for grabs, and who knows what happens. So nothing's really changed a whole lot. Saddam Hussein is allowed to maintain power in Iraq. People at the time criticized the coalition for not going into Baghdad and expelling or possibly killing Saddam. But again, the U.S. thought that that would just cause even more trouble. Eventually, we decided to do just that. About 12 years later, we go into Iraq with all our might, dispel of Saddam Hussein. And those fears that we had in 91 about what might happen if we kick Hussein out, they were right, because that's exactly what happened. Iraq's still up for grabs. Like, it's an absolute mess there, still to this day, because of what happened in 03. And I'm not saying we should have let that Saddam should have kept his post, but it has not been a smooth transition. And ironically, the president that ordered the second go around with Iraq was Bush 43, George H.W. Bush's son. But Operation Desert Storm is a huge risk because Iraq had nuclear weapons. They got them from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Iran-Iraq War. So there's a chance that this could have turned nuclear. Luckily, it didn't, but it very well could have. And Operation Desert Storm is the only other time, besides the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the U.S. has been on DEFCON level 2, and it's because of that nuclear possibility. It was very high stakes. So that was Operation Desert Storm. And that was the chapter. Now, the final essential question doesn't have to do necessarily with today's specific notes, but it's something I realized it's on the take-home test. It's a short answer. And I thought it'd be good to get you guys familiar with this. Name 3 Cold War conflicts between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now, when I say Cold War conflicts, they can be military, like actual battle, or they can be diplomatic conflicts. I don't want to give you a bunch of answers, but things like the building of nuclear weapons against each other. There's a better name for that, but I don't want to say it because it'll be the answer. Or, the creation of NASA, what that was in response to. I mean, those weren't armed conflicts, but they were still conflicts of a type against each other. And then you have 2 pretty major wars that we fought on opposite sides, and I do not mean World War I and World War II. Do not include that. Those are right in no way. There's a handful. I can think of probably 5 or 6 off the top of my head. But if you're still unsure what I'm asking for, email me. I don't want to just give away answers. I'll try and help out. But that is the end of this chapter. If I had more time, I'd talk about Rwanda, even though it's not a Cold War issue, but it's something that happened in the 90s that was extremely important that never gets talked about, or at least not as much as I think it should. So, um, but if you're curious, Google Rwandan genocide. It's pretty crazy. Um, I appreciate you guys tuning in and listening, and those of you that have done it every day and taken good notes and answered all the questions. I really appreciate you guys. You're awesome. Uh, always, I've thoroughly enjoyed my juniors this year and last year sophomores. I honestly, I will openly state that this is probably my favorite class of the four classes, four different grades I've had. So I really appreciate you guys and thank you for all your hard work. And I will be posting the take home test today. You will have the rest of today, the weekend, and the first 2.5 days of next week to work on it. So have a great day and have a terrific weekend.